2021 was an eventful year on Hacking Chinese, but which were the best articles and podcast episodes? Let's summarize the year that was and highlight things you really shouldn't miss. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about last year, and I'm going to highlight some things that happened during the year that you really shouldn't miss. And I do this with new readers and listeners in mind who might want to know what they missed during the year. And of course, I realize that most people don't have time to read or listen to all the articles, so this is a great way of summarizing the best ones and those you really shouldn't miss. If you did listen to all the podcasts, this is a great opportunity to write a review of the podcast, letting more people find out about it. And that is indeed something that is very helpful in general, so of course, even if you didn't listen to all the episodes, I would appreciate if you wrote a review on your favorite podcast platform. In general terms, I think 2021 was one of the most consistent years in the 11-year history of Hacking Chinese. I wrote one article every week, and I also published one podcast episode every week without exception. And that's not something I think I've been able to do before, and I'm happy about that. I also launched a new pronunciation course in 2021, and it just closed for registration for now, but if you're interested in that, you can head over to pronunciation.hackingchinese.com. Over at Hacking Chinese Challenges, I also ran 12 challenges focusing on different aspects of learning Chinese, and my New Year resolution for last year was to participate in all the challenges and do at least 15 hours for the passive ones, that would be reading and listening, and at least 7 hours for the active ones. And I succeeded with this for all challenges but one. There was a writing challenge that was rather badly timed with other things I was doing at the time. Overall, I think 11 out of 12 is a passing grade, and even though I wish I had more time to actually study Chinese than I do, I still think that went pretty well. How did you do in 2021? And I'm not asking this just in terms of challenges, I'm talking about learning Chinese in general. Did you reach any milestones? Maybe you reached a goal you set for yourself long ago or something like that. If you have something to share, it would be delightful if you headed over to Hacking Chinese and left a comment. As the title of this podcast implies, I will now go through the best articles on Hacking Chinese in 2021. And all the articles did have podcast episodes, so articles and episodes mean roughly the same thing. Naturally, best is a very subjective word, so I have taken it to mean two different things here. One is what I think, so that would be kind of an editor's choice. And the other one would be what you think, or not you in person, but all the visitors, so i.e. a popular vote based just on how many people read a certain article and listened to a certain podcast. The relationship between these two is not straightforward at all, so it's often the case that I write something that I think is really good and then nobody really cares about it. But it happens equally often that I write something that I'm not too happy with and I think nobody will really care about this, so why do I bother? And then it turns out to be the most popular article of the year, so who knows? I don't really understand this, and even after writing for 10 years, I don't know how to predict which articles will be popular. But as long as some articles are popular and you feel that I have contributed in some way to your learning, I'm happy. So let's start with the articles that I think are the most important from 2021. And if you want, you can think of this as answering the question, which articles I think you really shouldn't miss. In order to create a certain amount of excitement, we are going to start with article number 5 on my list and then gradually work our way up to the best article of the year. Number 5, 20 tips and tricks to improve your Chinese writing ability, which is podcast episode 28. It shouldn't come as a surprise that I like writing, and that is indeed why Hacking Chinese was started in the first place. I like writing, I like learning and teaching languages, and Hacking Chinese is a combination of the two. I have also taught many courses in writing, and this article that we're talking about summarizes the best advice I have to offer for people who want to increase their writing ability in Chinese or really any other language. The article focuses on 20 tips and tricks that you can use, and they are sorted into things you should do before you write, things you should think about or keep in mind while you are writing, and also things that you should do after you write. Number 4 on my list is the building blocks of Chinese, and I realized that I'm cheating here. That was actually a series of 6 articles that was published during the autumn of 2021, but the first article is the building blocks of Chinese part 1, Chinese characters and words in a nutshell, and that was podcast episode 54. And in that and the other 5 parts, I go through the Chinese writing system from the smallest components up to words and phrases. It's the most comprehensive thing I have so far when it comes to introducing Chinese characters here on Hacking Chinese. So if you find characters a bit confusing, then if you read or listen to this series, you will have a much better understanding of the building blocks and how they fit together. Number 3. Why your Chinese isn't as good as you think it ought to be. And this is episode 64 of the podcast. In this article, I answer various questions that I have seen students ask, or that they really should ask, over the years, and those relate to how good their Chinese is based on what they have been doing before. So if you've taken a certain number of courses, you've lived in China, or you've studied in a certain way, and you expect your Chinese to be at a certain level, maybe by comparing with other people, maybe by comparing with a textbook series or some courses or something, and you think that your Chinese is not as good as it ought to be, then in this article I try to straighten things out a bit and explain why it is that your Chinese might not be as good as you think it ought to be. Some important takeaways here include that you don't learn simply by saying that you've studied for a certain number of months or years, and if you're studying the wrong thing, it might not be very productive. So even if you have studied intensively for a certain number of months or years, that might still not convert to much practical ability if you are practicing the wrong things. The second most important article, in my own humble opinion, is again a series of articles, Chinese Language Logging Part 1, 2, and 3. And this is a series that I knew that most people wouldn't really fancy that much, but I also know that there are some people who are really into logging and think writing things down, keeping track of your learning is really helpful, both for motivation and for figuring out what you might be doing wrong, or also to figure out what you are doing right. So if you've never tried language logging and wonder what's so great about that, I suggest you tune into episode 41 of the podcast. If you are one of the aforementioned people who like logging already, I think the subsequent parts in that series will be more interesting. And that's episode 42 and 51 of the podcast. And now finally we have arrived at number 1, and that is Lost in Transcriptions, Say Law, Ice Island, and Aristotle. This article is about a problem that I haven't really seen many other people cover, and it's one that I find quite fascinating, and that is the difficulty of using names in different languages. And this doesn't really work for languages that are close to each other, but if we compare, say, English and Chinese, there are many names that are so different that you will not understand that it is the same person, place, or whatever it's referring to, unless you know it in advance. And that has some serious consequences for communication. And this goes for you speaking Chinese with Chinese people, but it applies equally well to talking to Chinese people in English. I also enjoyed writing this article a lot more than most other articles I wrote last year, and that is partly because I allowed it to take a lot longer. Obviously, I don't try to rush articles, and as you know by now, I write fairly long articles, but there is always a trade-off between the quality of the article and the value it actually presents in terms of content. So some articles take a lot of time to produce, not because of the writing itself, but because they are built on a lot of research that takes time. This article, though, doesn't contain a ton of research, but I still think it turned out quite nicely, and it's my favorite pick for 2021. And of course, there is a podcast episode for it, and that's number 44. So those were my picks, but I'm obviously biased because I wrote the articles and recorded the episodes. So let's look at what visitors and listeners thought about 2021 on Hacking Chinese. The fifth most popular article is My Best Advice on How to Learn Chinese Characters, which is episode 74 of the podcast. I don't think I need to say that much about the content here because this just contains the best advice I have on how to learn Chinese characters in general and in summarized form. And that this type of article becomes popular is not strange because, like I said before, there are lots of articles on Hacking Chinese, and if I write something that summarizes lots of content that already exists, that makes it more accessible for people, and it's also more interesting for people who maybe don't want to read a dozen articles but could consider reading one. Number 4 is the new HSK 3.0, What You Need to Know. This article was published both on Hacking Chinese and on the Skritter blog back in the summer of 2021 when the new HSK 3.0 came out. Or I should say the test didn't come out, but the standards that the new tests will be based on came out. And so far we don't really know much more than we did back then, so we don't have new tests and we don't even know when the lower level tests will come out. And this type of question is what we discussed in that article. because there were and still are a lot of misunderstandings about the new HSK. For example, many people struggle to understand how this would affect their own learning, and the short answer is that for most people it has zero impact on their learning, and yet many people equate HSK with learning Chinese, which is silly. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I suggest you check out episode 47 of the podcast. Number 3 in the popular vote is the 7 best Chinese reading resources for beginners, which was covered in episode 68 of the podcast. Again, I'm not too surprised because we're talking about reading resources and we're talking about beginners. And as a beginner, it is hard to figure out what to read, so that people find this type of article helpful isn't very surprising. It's perhaps worth mentioning that the article doesn't introduce 7 resources for beginners, but rather 7 types of resources, which means there are more like 30 or 35 actual resources in there. Over to number 2 in the popular vote, and that is learning the third tone in Mandarin Chinese, which we covered in episode 26 of the podcast. The third tone is probably the tone that causes the most trouble for learners, and the fact that it's also badly taught and that there are lots of misconceptions about how it is supposed to be pronounced certainly doesn't make it easier. So in that episode, I explain how the third tone works, why it can sometimes cause trouble, and how you should deal with those. The key realization here is that the third tone is a low tone. It is not a dipping tone, except in some very specific situations. So check out that article or episode if you struggle with the third tone. Now we have finally reached number 1, the most popular article last year, and that was the 10 best free Chinese reading resources for beginners, intermediate, and advanced learners, which is episode 33 of the podcast. As the title implies, this article covers a lot of resources, 10 for each level, so 30 in total. And this is the article that took by far the most time to research, because even if I list 30 resources here, I checked out more than 100, probably closer to 200, before selecting which to recommend. And of course, I'm not saying that I've found the perfect resources, but I do think that this is the best available list of resources. If you don't agree with me, I'm always eager to hear of new resources I might have missed. But if you just want some free reading resources, this is the article for you. Now that we've gone through my favorite articles and also the most popular ones, I should also mention that there are several pages on Hacking Chinese that are actually quite popular and that you shouldn't miss. So if we're just looking at articles and episodes, we will miss some content. Some examples include pages I've written for specific levels, so there is a page only for beginners. There are also various courses that you can access in the main menu and simply clicking courses. Finally, there are also category pages, which introduces certain skills or areas of learning Chinese. So for example, listening ability has its own page. And you can access these and the level-adjusted pages simply by clicking articles in the menu. And that page was also rearranged completely recently to give visitors a better overview of all the content that exists on Hacking Chinese. So a happy new year! It's a little bit late for the solar new year. We've had 2022 for a few weeks now, and it's a little bit early for the year of the tiger, but happy new year anyway. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.